A lone farmhouse stood under the vast sky, surrounded by golden fields swaying with the wind. The sun had begun its descent, painting the horizon in warm hues of orange and purple. Inside, Jacob, a middle-aged farmer with calloused hands and a heart full of kindness, wiped the sweat off his brow. It had been another long, tiring day on his small farm, but he was used to the struggle. Jacob lived a simple life. He had inherited this land from his father and worked tirelessly to keep it running. Despite facing years of drought, financial struggles, and market uncertainties, he wasn't wealthy, but he had enough to get by. More than that, he had a strong belief in helping others whenever he could. To him, kindness didn't require riches, just a willing heart. As he fed his cattle and prepared to retire for the night, a sudden sound interrupted the peaceful silence. A distant rumble of an engine followed by the unmistakable noise of tires skidding on the gravel road outside his property. Jacob turned toward the sound, narrowing his eyes as he spotted a vehicle on the roadside, its headlights flickering before going completely dark. A figure stepped out of the stalled vehicle, staggering slightly. It was a man, perhaps in his mid-30s, dressed in a suit that looked completely out of place in the rural countryside. Jacob's instincts told him something wasn't right. This wasn't a place where travelers often passed through, and the nearest town was miles away. Curiosity mixed with concern as Jacob grabbed a flashlight and approached the stranger. "Evening, sir," he called out. "Car trouble." The man looked up, his face pale and exhausted. "Yeah, I think my engine just died. My phone's out of battery too." His voice was hoarse, and there was a weariness in his eyes that Jacob couldn't ignore. Jacob could have simply pointed the man toward the town and gone back to his evening routine. But something told him to do more. He had been raised to never turn away someone in need. "Come on inside," Jacob said, gesturing toward his house. "You can rest up and figure things out in the morning." The stranger hesitated, glancing between his car and the small farmhouse. "Are you sure? I don't want to be a bother." Jacob gave a small smile. "I wouldn't offer if I didn't mean it. Looks like you've had a rough day. A warm meal and a place to rest won't hurt." The man nodded slowly, gratitude flickering in his tired eyes. "Thank you. I really appreciate it." As Jacob led the stranger toward his home, he had no idea that this single act of kindness would change his life forever. Jacob led the stranger into his modest farmhouse, switching on a warm yellow light that flickered slightly before settling. The living room was simple, wooden furniture, a well-worn couch, and a small dining table covered with a checkered cloth. A faint aroma of baked bread lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of soil and fresh hay from outside. "Have a seat," Jacob said, pulling out a chair. "I'll get you some water." The man nodded, lowering himself onto the chair with a deep sigh. Up close, Jacob could see the exhaustion etched into his face, dark circles under his eyes, a crease between his brows, and a weariness that went beyond just physical fatigue. Jacob returned with a glass of water, setting it in front of him. "So, what's your name?" The man took a long sip before answering. "Daniel. Daniel Whitmore." Jacob furrowed his brow. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. Shrugging it off, he leaned against the counter. "What brings you out here, Daniel?" "Not many folks take this road unless they have a reason." Daniel let out a small, dry chuckle. "Believe me, I didn't plan on being here either. I was heading to a business meeting in the next town over when my GPS took me on this detour. Before I knew it, my car started overheating, and here I am." Jacob nodded. "Bad luck, but you're safe now. You hungry?" Daniel hesitated for only a second before nodding. "I won't lie. I haven't eaten since morning." Jacob didn't say a word. Instead, he walked over to the kitchen and began putting together a simple meal, a bowl of hearty vegetable stew, a slice of freshly baked bread, and a piece of cheese. He set it down in front of Daniel, who stared at it for a moment before digging in. For a while, there was only silence, broken only by the occasional clink of the spoon against the bowl. Jacob watched as Daniel ate with quiet intensity, as though he hadn't had a proper meal in days. "You live alone?" Daniel asked between bites. Jacob nodded. "Been that way for a while now. My wife passed years ago. Never had kids. Just me, the land, and a few cows to keep me company." A shadow passed over Daniel's face, but he quickly masked it. "I'm sorry for your loss." Jacob gave a small nod. "It's been years. You get used to the quiet after a while." Daniel set his spoon down. "I can't imagine that." I barely get a moment of quiet in my life. Jacob chuckled. City life? You could say that, Daniel muttered, running a hand through his disheveled hair. I run a company. It's demanding. Now Jacob understood why the name sounded familiar. Daniel Whitmore, CEO of a major investment firm. He had seen the name in passing on financial news, though he never paid much attention to that kind of world. Must be stressful, Jacob commented. Daniel let out a bitter laugh. That's an understatement. He sighed, rubbing his temple. Look, I don't want to bore you with my problems. You've already done more for me than I could have asked for. Jacob studied him for a moment before shaking his head. It's not a bother. A man's troubles don't disappear just because he keeps them to himself. Daniel exhaled slowly, as if weighing his words. Finally, he spoke. I built my company from the ground up. Spent years working, sacrificing, pushing myself. Now, it feels like I'm losing control. The people around me don't see me as a person anymore, just a machine that keeps things running. Investors, board members, employees, they all expect something from me, and no matter how much I give, it's never enough. Jacob listened quietly, allowing the words to settle. He had seen this before. People who spent their entire lives chasing something, only to realize too late that they had lost themselves in the process. Daniel ran a hand over his face. I don't know why I'm telling you all this. Maybe because you're a stranger, and I don't have to worry about judgment. He let out a small, tired chuckle. Jacob smiled faintly. Stranger or not, sometimes you just need to say things out loud to make sense of them. Daniel nodded, as if absorbing the words. He looked around the small house, so different from the luxury he was used to. It was quiet, peaceful, untouched by the rush of the outside world. For the first time in a long while, he felt safe. Jacob stood up, stretching. You can stay the night. There's an extra room down the hall. Morning's the best time to figure out a plan for your car. Daniel hesitated. I don't want to intrude. Jacob shook his head. No trouble at all. Besides, you look like you could use a good night's sleep. Daniel gave a small, grateful nod. Thank you, Jacob. Really? Jacob simply patted his shoulder. Get some rest, son. Tomorrow's another day. As Daniel made his way to the guest room, he couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, this unexpected detour was exactly what he needed. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the old wooden blinds, casting soft golden stripes across the guest room. Daniel blinked awake, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The air smelled of fresh coffee and something warm and buttery. Biscuits, maybe? For a moment, he just lay there, listening. No blaring horns, no ringing phones, no urgent emails. Just birds chirping outside and the occasional distant moo of a cow. It was a strange kind of quiet, but he didn't mind it. Rubbing his face, he forced himself out of bed, stretching his sore muscles before making his way to the kitchen. Jacob was already there, sipping coffee at the small wooden table, a plate of biscuits and eggs in front of him. Morning, Jacob greeted without looking up from his plate. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. Morning. I slept better than I have in a long time. Jacob gestured to the seat across from him. That's what fresh air and hard work do to a man. Sit down. Eat. Daniel hesitated for a second before pulling out a chair. He hadn't had a home-cooked breakfast in years. Everything in his world was always rushed. Meetings, meals, decisions. He picked up a biscuit and took a bite, the warm, flaky texture melting in his mouth. This is really good, he admitted, half surprised. Jacob smirked. Would have been better if I still had some fresh butter. Gotta make do with what we have. Daniel nodded, chewing thoughtfully. After a moment, he set his fork down. I really appreciate everything you've done. Letting me stay the night, feeding me. Jacob waved a hand dismissively. It's what folks used to do for each other. World's gotten too busy, people forgot how to be decent. Daniel exhaled, nodding. Yeah, busy is one way to put it. Jacob studied him for a moment before leaning back in his chair. You ever worked on a farm before? Daniel let out a dry chuckle. Not unless you count managing assets in agriculture. Jacob rolled his eyes. That don't count. He took a sip of his coffee. Since your car's still sitting in the same sorry state as yesterday, why don't you make yourself useful? Help out with the morning chores. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You're putting me to work? Jacob shrugged. That's how we do things around here. Nothing comes free. Daniel stared at him for a beat before smirking. All right, fine. But I'm warning you. I'm not exactly manual labor material. Jacob chuckled. Don't worry. I'll start you off easy. Minutes later, Daniel found himself standing near a wooden fence, staring at a field full of cows. The sun was already getting higher, warming the land, and he could feel the sweat starting to form on his brow. Jacob handed him a pitchfork. "All right, city boy, time to clean the stalls." Daniel groaned. "Oh, come on, this is a joke, right?" Jacob simply grinned. "Nope." With a sigh, Daniel got to work. It was messy, exhausting, and more physical labor than he'd done in years. His expensive loafers were ruined within minutes, and his shirt stuck uncomfortably to his back. But oddly enough, it felt good. There was something satisfying about the simplicity of it, doing a task, seeing the result, no board meetings or stock prices involved. After what felt like forever, he leaned on the pitchfork, panting. "All right, I think I'm dying." Jacob laughed. "You'll live." He handed Daniel a bottle of water. "Not bad for a first-timer. Thought you'd quit after 5 minutes." Daniel took a long drink before smirking. "You underestimate my stubbornness." Jacob nodded approvingly. "That's a good quality to have, as long as you don't let it blind you." Daniel exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "Yeah, I think I've been doing that a lot lately." Jacob leaned against the fence, looking out over the open field. "Let me tell you something, Daniel. Money's useful, but it ain't everything. People chase it thinking it'll fix all their problems, but at the end of the day, what really matters is who you have beside you, who you are when all the noise is gone." Daniel let the words sink in. For years, he had built his life around success, always pushing for more, never stopping. But sitting here, on this farm, covered in dirt and sweat, he felt lighter. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't just Daniel Whitmore, CEO. He was just Daniel. And maybe that was exactly what he needed. The days that followed were unlike anything Daniel had ever experienced. Each morning, he woke up at dawn to the sound of roosters crowing and the distant hum of life on the farm. Instead of slipping into a tailored suit, he pulled on an old shirt Jacob had loaned him, one that smelled of hay and hard work. And instead of checking his emails over an overpriced latte, he found himself feeding chickens, repairing fences, and learning the rhythm of a life that had nothing to do with boardrooms or billion-dollar deals. At first, his muscles ached from the work. His hands, soft from years of luxury, developed blisters. But gradually, he adjusted. There was something oddly grounding about it, something real. The dirt beneath his fingernails, the sweat on his brow, the satisfaction of completing a task that had nothing to do with money or power. One afternoon, as he and Jacob worked on repairing a section of the barn's roof, Daniel finally asked the question that had been on his mind since he arrived. "Why do you live alone out here?" Jacob, who was hammering a nail into the wooden beam, paused for a moment before continuing. "Didn't always," he said simply. Daniel wiped sweat from his forehead. "What happened?" Jacob let out a slow breath. "Had a wife once. Kids, too. This place was full of life back in the day. Then my wife got sick. Medical bills took everything we had. Lost her, then lost my boy to the city. He wanted a life away from all this." Daniel felt a pang in his chest. "You don't talk to him?" Jacob shook his head. "Haven't heard from him in years. Maybe I was too stubborn, or maybe he just didn't see a place for himself here anymore." He turned to Daniel, his gaze steady. "That's the thing about chasing success. Sometimes, you run so fast, you don't realize what you're leaving behind." The words hit Daniel harder than he expected. He thought about his own life, the long hours, the constant pressure, the relationships that had faded because he was always too busy. He had sacrificed so much to get where he was. But for what? "I think I get it," Daniel said quietly. Jacob studied him for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, I think you do." That evening, Daniel sat on the porch, sipping a cold beer Jacob had offered him. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the fields. It was beautiful, peaceful, so different from the chaos he was used to. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked as Jacob settled into the chair beside him. Jacob smirked. "And go where?" "This is my home." Daniel nodded slowly. "I used to think success meant climbing higher, getting more. But maybe I've been looking at it all wrong." Jacob chuckled. "Took you long enough to figure that out." Daniel laughed, shaking his head. "Yeah, I guess it did." For the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe. And for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted to go back to the life he had left behind. Days turned into a week, and Daniel found himself growing more accustomed to life on the farm. The once foreign tasks, milking cows, mending fences, hauling feed, became second nature. He no longer craved the noise of the city, the constant beeping of notifications, or the urgency of his former life. Instead, he found peace in the simplicity of the land, in the quiet moments spent under the wide-open sky. But as much as he had grown to love this place, a decision loomed over him. He couldn't stay here forever, could he? One evening, as he and Jacob shared a quiet dinner of roasted chicken and freshly baked bread, Jacob finally asked the question Daniel had been avoiding. "You ever gonna tell me who you really are?" Daniel froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. He hadn't spoken much about his past, at least not in detail. But he knew he couldn't keep dodging the truth forever. With a deep breath, he set down his fork and met Jacob's gaze. "My name is Daniel Carter. I run a multi-million-dollar investment firm in the city. Or at least, I used to." Jacob didn't look surprised. "Figured you were someone important. Ain't too many folks in suits wandering the countryside." Daniel let out a small chuckle. "I thought money, power, and success were everything. I spent years chasing it, building an empire. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of why I started in the first place." He sighed. "Then, a few weeks ago, I got caught up in a deal that went south. I was betrayed by people I trusted, my reputation was on the line, and he hesitated before admitting, I ran." Jacob studied him for a long moment. "And now?" Daniel leaned back in his chair, looking out at the darkening sky. "Now I don't know." Jacob nodded slowly. "Sounds like you got some choices to make." The next morning, Daniel stood at the edge of the farm, staring down the long road that led back to the world he had left behind. His car, now repaired, was waiting for him. Jacob stood beside him, arms crossed. "So, what's it gonna be?" Daniel exhaled. "I don't know if I'm ready to go back." Jacob shrugged. "Then don't." Daniel turned to him. "It's not that simple." "Sure it is," Jacob said. "You've seen both sides now. You know what life out here is like, and you know what life in the city is like. The question is, which one do you actually want?" Daniel hesitated. He thought about the long nights at the office, the constant pressure, the emptiness he had felt even at the height of his success. Then he thought about the past weeks, the sense of purpose he had found in working the land, the conversations with Jacob, the freedom of waking up without the weight of the world on his shoulders. For the first time in his life, he had a choice. Finally, he turned to Jacob and smiled. "I think I already know the answer." Jacob grinned. "Figured you might." Daniel took one last look at the road ahead. Then, without another word, he turned away from it. He wasn't going back. The decision to stay on the farm wasn't just about avoiding the life Daniel had left behind. It was about choosing something better, something real. Days passed, and Daniel embraced his new path with conviction. He woke up before sunrise, tended to the animals, repaired broken fences, and planted crops alongside Jacob. The satisfaction of a hard day's work was unlike anything he had ever felt before. There was no stress of board meetings, no late-night emails, no scheming business partners. Just the land, the sky, and the honest work in between. For the first time in years, Daniel felt at peace. One afternoon, as Daniel was stacking hay in the barn, he heard the sound of approaching vehicles. The crunch of tires on gravel made him pause. He stepped outside, wiping sweat from his brow, and saw a convoy of sleek black SUVs pulling into the farm. His heart pounded. He recognized those cars. Jacob walked up beside him. "Friends of yours?" Daniel swallowed hard. "Something like that." The doors opened, and out stepped several men in tailored suits. At the front was a familiar face, Richard Langley, his company's senior partner. Richard smirked as he approached. "Daniel Carter, you've certainly made yourself hard to find." Daniel squared his shoulders. "Wasn't trying to be found." Richard chuckled. "You disappear for weeks, and the business world goes crazy. We assumed you were dead or plotting some elaborate comeback." He glanced around at the farm. "Didn't expect this." Daniel crossed his arms. "What do you want?" Richard pulled out a file and handed it to him. "You own half the firm, Daniel. Your name is still on everything. But the board is ready to move forward without you. If you sign these papers, you can walk away. Completely. We'll buy out your shares. No lawsuits. No public scandals. You'll be free." Daniel opened the file and scanned the contents. The sum was astronomical, more money than most people would ever see in their lifetime. Jacob watched quietly, not saying a word. Daniel took a deep breath. Just weeks ago, this amount of money would have been everything to him. But now he knew the true cost of that world. Slowly, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a pen, and signed the documents. Richard raised an eyebrow. Just like that. Daniel handed the file back. Just like that. Richard smirked. I have to admit, I didn't expect you to give it all up so easily. Daniel turned to look at the farm, at Jacob, at the rolling fields stretching beyond the horizon. I'm not giving anything up, he said. For the first time in my life, I'm choosing what actually matters. Richard shook his head in amusement. Well, best of luck, Daniel. If you ever change your mind, you know where to find me. Daniel watched as the SUVs turned around and disappeared down the road. He felt no regret, no second-guessing, only relief. Jacob clapped him on the back. Well, looks like you're officially unemployed. Daniel laughed. I prefer self-employed. Jacob grinned. Welcome to the real world, son. As the sun began to set over the fields, Daniel knew. This wasn't just a temporary escape. This was home.